Our next speaker, it's actually someone I've known for quite some time, Tammy Moscow. She is going to be talking about reclaiming the best interest lens for trans children. Tammy is actually counsel, personal rights department with the Office of the Children's Lawyer. I won't say that too loud. She's actually a supervisor of mine on some of my files, the OCL files. And looking forward to hearing from you, Tammy. Please help us welcoming Tammy. Thank you. There should be, he's coming up.
Oh, perfect.
He's the right man.
Do you want to introduce part two? Because she's doing, Allison's doing the part two.
Oh, okay.
So there's a break, but might as well introduce us both.
Sure.
Do you have the notes?
I should. No, it doesn't matter. I could always
Okay.
look.
Okay, good. Perfect. And how do we go between?
The remote right there.
Perfect, okay.
Okay. So I'm going to apologize. Actually, the second speaker, I'm going to apologize to Allison Williams, community development lawyer, Justice for Children and Youth, who is also a speaker today. She will be discussing the second part of reclaiming the best interest lens for trans children. Please help me welcome Allison as well.
I'm not so tall. Hi, everyone. I have the end of that awful cold that was going around, so I will be coughing. I was just warning you, there's nothing contagious about it. I was sick 4 weeks ago. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm not supposed to be political, but I can't think of a more important time for this topic. I come to you with personal and professional experience. I'm the proud child of a 20-year-old non-binary parent. I'm not a child. Well, I am a child, but proud parent of a 20-year-old non-binary. So we've been on the journey personally. It's been a really hard week for them. It's been a hard week for many of my queer friends and family. And so I'm really grateful for having the time to talk to you about this really important issue. Allison is going to do part two. I thank you for squeezing me in early. I actually have a flight for a girls' trip. I'm going to Charlotte this afternoon and had to be able to get to Pearson by a certain time. So there will be, I think, a break between us for a presentation by one of the sponsors. We don't have a lot of time. I think we have 30 minutes each, including any questions. So this is really an introductory topic. It's something I can talk about for hours and hours and hours. Those of you on the Children's Lawyer panel will be hearing me and my colleague Patrick Sensen and Dylan Purdon, one of our panel lawyers, talk about this next week. We're doing a 2-hour training, but this is our introductory session. So the first general principles I want to just explain to you is that it's actually not that novel. And if you don't know someone who has been on a gender journey, you likely will, especially if you're practicing in family law. 100,000 Canadians do already identify as trans or non-binary, and the proportion, not surprisingly, are higher for younger adults. I could spend, well, someone other than me could spend an hour explaining to you all of the permutations. The bottom line is take the cue from the individual, just like you would do with any other vulnerable group, and this group is particularly vulnerable, as we'll get to. But gender can be expressed either in a binary, on a spectrum, or with some fluidity. And especially with youth, sometimes there's a journey and a process. So the terminology that is most common is trans, meaning you don't identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. Gender diverse or gender fluid, which is taking a concept of gender runs along a spectrum and the person finds themselves somewhere on that spectrum. And non-binary, which is that they reject the notion of two genders and again find themselves somewhere in the middle. Really important for the context of family law, and especially because this issue has been so politicized. Gender-affirming care is on a spectrum. And so no, kids are not going on recess and getting top surgery. I promise you. Usually transition starts with a social transition, and names and pronouns are usually what kids try out first. My experience is more with older youth, so I want to focus on that segment. So I'm not talking about should the three-year-old's gender be shared by parents. Like, I'm really talking about kids who have independence and capacity and are on the process to or have made their own decisions. I point out that when my 11-year-old nephew, who's now in medical school at Cork, when he was 11, he decided that he would only respond if people called him a hockey player's name. And I don't even remember what hockey player it was. So we all called him this hockey player's name, and no one thought twice about it. So he wasn't the hockey player. We knew he wasn't the hockey player, but he was starting to assert his own identity. And it's so upsetting to me that when kids do that with respect to gender, all of a sudden it's this big deal, and we have to intervene on their autonomy and growing independence. Legal transitions are ridiculously difficult. I'm a lawyer. I thought I could do this kind of easily for my child. The province is not coordinated with the federal, and for the province you have to start with this document and that document, and it's actually really challenging. There actually are clinics that we refer to quite regularly in order to assist the youth with these issues. Medical is also along a spectrum. So I'm not a doctor, and I'm not here to share my youth's personal experience with you, but I can tell you there is a process. And there is a process that starts under the care of a doctor. My child is also a cancer survivor. No one questioned the advice of their medical professionals when it came to their physical health. And as you'll see, affirming their gender identity has direct effects on their emotional and physical health. So I wish we had comprehensive counseling access for these kids. I wish that I was not at one point spending over $2,000 a month for counseling support for my kids. We can do it, and that's great, and I don't think it's one or the other. These kids need the support of the professionals, and that can start with their pediatricians, that should have some mental health support, and then often psychiatry gets involved. And I'm really just giving you this kind of big picture so that you understand that it's a process. And obviously we need to trust our medical professionals, but I often joke that in family law, people will fight about just about anything, from the kid's first haircut to who holds the whatever report card. But this is an issue that people do fight about and do feel strongly about. So I just wanted to dispel some of the myths that are floating around about the level of thought and intention and care that goes along supporting these kids along the way. I'll also point out that I know many colleagues and friends whose kids have had hormone therapy to avoid going into puberty early. No one batted an eyelash. So they're getting gender affirming, they're getting the same physical care, but only once it's connected with gender identity, kind of does the hysteria set in. So like I did with my child, I suggest proceeding in an affirming and supportive and thoughtful way. So I actually made my child try on their name for 6 months before I would do any of the legal changes. And we called them by their name, and they were called by their name at school, but our process has worked for our family. And there's a way to approach this issue in a child-centered, best interest lens, which is the law. And it's how we're obliged to approach these, whether in the child protection or in the family law context. And there are real issues that these families struggle with. There are cultural issues. There are religious issues. There are, this is not what I expected for my child issues. there's fear. I see how trans people are treated in the world. My child sees how trans people are treated in the world. So there's a lot of valid stuff and big emotions and lots of fears that these families are working through. But I always try and bring it back to what is in the best interest of this child. I could spend hours on this. I think I have 2 or 3 slides. The risk of not affirming the child's gender are awful. So we know that there's a mental health crisis amongst youth, regardless of gender being an issue. I think more of my kids, I have a 14-year-old too, more of these kids are diagnosed with anxiety and mood disorders than not. So when you throw gender into the mix, it's exponential. So risk of suicide, homelessness, anxiety, depression, self-harm, they skyrocket when their kids are not supported. These are some, what I've given you here is Canadian, mostly Canadian studies. The American studies are the same, but I've tried to give you also stuff that is more research-based than advocacy-based. Not that I don't accept the advocacy-based stuff, but the research stuff is harder to argue with because they've looked at kids and they've looked at thousands of kids. And there's one study that's a bit old, it's around 10 years old from Toronto, that says, essentially, it breaks down a third in terms of caregiver support for trans youth. So a third of parents or caregivers are outwardly supportive, a third are in the mushy middle, and a third are outwardly unsupportive. So, like, this is really horrifying, and when I have discussions with well-meaning, well-intentioned people, and they say, well, parents always know right. Like, every parent's gonna support their child. The research, unfortunately, doesn't support that. And of course, we see it in family law, where one or both of the parents may not be supportive. And I see it in child protection. So one of the programs that I supervise is for 16 and 17-year-olds who are trying to get support from the Children's Aid Society because they don't get the support that they need at home. I had one awful case last year where the child had tried to run away before 16, was forced to come home, ran away at 16, or before they ran away, the parent found out that they identified as non-binary, locked them in their room for a week, didn't let them go to school, and took away their devices, and brought in their priest to pray away the queer. Now, like, think about the message that's being sent to this kid. Oh, also threatened to send them back to China to go to private school to get fixed, which is where they were born. So I got involved, and I'm working with the Children's Aid Society, and I'm like, what are you doing? You gotta help this kid. And I heard, well, our focus is family reunification. And I was like banging my head against the wall. I'm like, well, this is not a family that has the capacity to support this youth. Like, yes, there are many families that struggle. I get that. And in discussions with, I've done some presentations with Bennett Jensen, who's the legal director at EGAL. He acknowledges families can struggle, but they can't put it on the kid. Because when you put it on the kid is when they are at increased risk of awful consequences. So 8 weeks went by, and this child was living with a friend's parents, so they weren't at immediate risk of harm. So I'm like trying to be nice, and I'm trying, you know, that you get more with honey, you get more with honey. And finally I said to this worker, I actually called the legal director, and I said, like, I knew her, I was like, Lauren, I got a visa, I just need a visa, we gotta move forward. This worker is well-intentioned, but really, really missing the theme here. I said, like, I'll sue you. I would very happily sue you in this circumstance. I don't think you want to go down as the society that didn't help this child when the facts were so, so clear. Like, these parents were driving around the community trying to retrieve the child. I was ready to go get a restraining order for them. So I got the visa the next day. And we are doing a lot of training in the child protection context, because in 2018, when the Child Youth Family Services Act was increased to include the 16 and 17-year-olds, they didn't really focus on the different issues that are presenting with older youth. So we still have this kind of, I see, this family reunification lens, which is really important, especially in some cultures where we went the wrong way and we yanked kids like really much too fast. But, you know, these kids need support. It is the only way to turn around the trajectory for them. And anyways, so that was my recent success. 57% reported of LGBTQ students reported moderate to high levels of anxiety versus 28% of their peers. And from what I understand, it's worse with gender as opposed to just sexuality. And I don't say just sexuality, but I think our society is better at supporting different sexualities. I think it's still struggling with the gender, I shouldn't say challenge, but gender diversity. Suicidal ideation, etc. Approximately 25% of trans and non-binary youth feel they do not feel safe at home. And these studies, again, are with 16 plus. So again, not, you know, the 3-year-old, can they wear a tutu? A different conversation. Older youth who really, I mean, I can't think of anything that goes more to someone's core and their identity than their gender expression. LGBTQ students overall reported lower rates of parental support during difficult time, lower rates of having their mental needs met by their families, and lower rates of being respected at school. That's a 2021 study from New Brunswick. Like this is really scary. Bullying and abuse in school, especially I see TJE as trans and gender expansive. I'm trying out that language because I like it better than diverse. I find it more positive. But 60 to 82% of gender diverse youth had experienced bullying at school. So these kids are getting it at home and they're getting it at school. I'm not going to say that it's all bullying, but a significant portion, like 2/3, aren't getting the support they need at home, and then they go to school and they don't necessarily get it either. Higher rates of homelessness. So this is something that both Allison and I see right away. Kids being thrown out, kids not being respected, kids not feeling safe at home, 2 to 4 times more likely to become homeless, and family rejection is a significant factor in that. Twice as likely to have run away in the past year, twice as likely to have been kicked out of the home. I'm going to let Allison cover Hansman.
Yeah, I just, when Tammy and I were putting together our presentation, I think, can you put the slide back up? I think we, sorry, wrong way. I just wanted to make sure that this group, when we're talking about the framing of the issue from a legal perspective, that the Hansman decision from the Supreme Court is a really important one to review. You know, it's a clear recognition of the transgender community as an undeniably marginalized group. So I would just encourage anyone, if you're representing trans clients, to be familiar with that decision as an important precedent in framing the issue in the legal context as well as the important research that Tammy's highlighted.
Yeah, it's we're at early stages of the courts grappling with these issues. And so you'll see there is one slide where I'm not going to go into detail. There are a number of family law and child protection cases, but Hansman's a great one just in terms of where you can pull some of this information or ask for judicial notice of certain basic facts relating to these individuals. So here's the happy slide. Bennett helped us with this. Affirmation has a tremendously positive impact. They're especially, these youth especially reliant upon their trusted adults, but it also can be teachers, guidance counselors, school social workers. Youth who felt safe at home or connected with their family were less likely to report severe emotional distress. Being able to use a chosen name at school, I'm not supposed to be political, but I'm just going to throw that in there, predicted fewer depressive symptoms and greater self-esteem. And LGBTQ focused policies in school act as a protective factor. So those of you who don't know, Office of the Children's Lawyers, where I work, we have two sides. I work on the personal rights side, which is the parenting and child protection. We have a legal arm and we have a clinical arm, and we are mostly involved on the court's request, either for child protection or family cases, but then I have this really interesting program. We get around 400 to 500 cases a year, or referrals a year for these 16 and 17-year-olds. This is where they're coming, interacting with the society, and they're asking for help on a voluntary basis. This was part of the 2018 amendments, which realized that kids of this age, you can't really force them into care, because if they don't want to be there, they'll walk with their feet. So we work on voluntary arrangements. Sometimes the society notifies us that the child has asked for help and they don't want to give the help. So that's where we do some really good advocacy for the kids, assuming there are grounds and they meet the legislative tests. It's interesting, often this issue in the child protection context is kind of thrown under the parent-teen conflict umbrella. So parent-teen conflict has to be pretty bad in order to justify a child to be found in need of protection. What we're trying to do is move it over to the risk of emotional and physical harm. Because as you've seen in the research, the emotional harm is clear, the risk of the physical harm is clear too. Like, I don't know about you, but when I drive by these kind of tent cities and stuff, and I see these 16-year-old kids, it breaks my heart. Like they're kids. So it's a really wonderful part of our program. If you're on the OCL panel or if you're thinking about it, it doesn't take a lot of experience. If you're good with older youth, I'll put you on this work right away. Just let me know. We do a quick and dirty training session, and it's really some of the most rewarding work that we do. Legal framework, those of you who do this work will know. I do want to point out that the CIFSA, the Child and Youth Family Services Act, specifically includes a consideration of gender identity and gender expression. So best interest of the child, of course, but the specific gender issues are flagged as a consideration for placement decisions. Obviously, we don't want to be taking kids from a home and putting them into another place where they're even less safe because of this issue and their overall vulnerabilities. Children's Law Reform Act has everything you need under the best interest test, including the child's needs and the caregiver or the proposed caregiver's ability to meet those needs. Allison is going to talk about this more, the legal framework that interacts with child protection and family law. I will say that in child protection in particular, but also in family law, we do often come up across the Healthcare Consent Act and we call it PHIPAA, Personal Health Information Protection Act, access to the child's records, the child's ability to make age-appropriate decisions. Back when I started doing family law almost 30 years ago, we just assumed that the parents made all decisions for the kids. And we didn't realize that, I didn't realize, it wasn't an issue, it wasn't seen as an issue that kids actually have the capacity to make some of these decisions for on their own. So it's not, in Ontario is not like Alberta, and Allison's going to cover this more. I promised her I wouldn't get into the stuff. So my bottom line is that there's more questions than answers when you're working in this area in terms of some of the things that I've talked about. I do want to mention the need to consider the overlapping and intersecting vulnerabilities. The research is clear, particularly with Black and Indigenous youth. The overlapping vulnerabilities, poorer outcomes. Different parenting approaches to these issues can be hugely problematic, very challenging. Society working with the parents, kind of how much leeway should they be given, what's appropriate, all sorts of issues that we're working through. Societies do not need to validate the risk of harm, so there are things that need to be established. I find sometimes they don't take a particularly child-focused approach on that. Not a queer child, but I had one child who really didn't feel safe at home. And the society talked to the parent, and it was a dad, and dad said, of course, like, so-and-so can come home. And the kid was actually sleeping on the concrete stairwell of the condo building. And I said, well, I think maybe your perception of the impact that the conflict is having on the child isn't quite aligned with the child. Can you reconsider this? Like, I don't sleep on, would you sleep on a concrete stairwell if you didn't have to? So sometimes I have to like do a bit of like a common sense kind of, you know? Yeah, really, really challenging situations. I can't wait to have a good court decision, hint, hint, that points out some of these vulnerabilities. Because what we're seeing in child protection, most child protection cases don't get reported, understandably, and in family law too. So here is the case law that we have found. You'll see it's mostly within the last 5 years, but significance of gender identity and significance of parental support for gender identity. So I don't want to go into each one. The SF decision was Justice Frageau out of Northwest. He took judicial notice of the magnitude of the decision for the 13-year-old. I thought that was really cool. Like he actually noticed how important it would have been to this child and what a big step it would have been. Nova Scotia and GM, mom's struggle to acceptance was a form of risk to the child. Primary residence in JPK was changed where the father was more supportive, and supervised access where mom wouldn't accept gender identity. And again, there is a spectrum of acceptance. I'm not saying that this should be the automatic result in each case, but these are some of the tools that you have available to you if you're facing a parent on the other side who is not being supportive, or if you do our work and are representing these very vulnerable kids. So I think that's good. So how are we for timing? I don't know if it's a good break time, or should I open to questions? Because I unfortunately can't stay until after Allison's presentation.
Your indulgence, everyone, for one moment. You have till 1:45, so I didn't know if Allison was talking now.
What time is it?
It's only 10:30, so it's really up to you.
Let me open up for questions.
Because I can bring the leap in too, so.
Yeah, let me. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm happy to answer them. The next presenter is also available, so yeah. And thank you very much for having me. I really, I think as a system, we have a fair ways to go to properly support these kids. And I really hate how political this issue has been. And I'd really like to go back to focusing on individual children and how we can best support them in the context of the legal disputes that they're facing. Yes?
Do we have a microphone in the room too? Thank you.
Hi, Sarah from Elgin Law Association. We had a gloss over comment earlier about how you were paying $2,000 a month in counseling services. From someone who knows very little about this issue, what are costs? And there's obviously a financial barrier for these kids as well. Does CAS assist in any way with that, or are we looking for outside sources? Like how are these children funded?
So to be fair, it was for both of my children. And one was on a gender journey and the other has OCD, and I was just paying private counseling fees. This is a huge systemic problem, and it's a problem in family law and in child protection. If the society is involved with the child, they should be getting support for them, but you're often faced with terrible wait lists because they have their roster of people who will accept their fees, or they're going to the overburdened community resources. So what my experience has been that our system's okay with immediate crisis management, but providing any medium or long-term support is a real gap. Some people, lots of people, even not wealthy people, if you have a good if you have a good health plan, it can offset those costs. If parents have health plans in different employment, they can claim through both. But it's a real challenge. And it also can be a challenge to find LGBTQ supportive counselors. So, I don't think that there's a shortage of it necessarily, but that's a particular, obviously you need to have those supports for these kids. I also really do encourage, so the society workers, I find they're all very well-intentioned, but some have more capacity and more time to work with these kids. There are fantastic province-wide resources. So get the kids on peer chats online, get the kids to local groups, get the kids support in, however you can. Community services are great. Parents might need help too, right? So they're actually, I can send it to Ian later, but there's a link that Toronto CAS had circulated or prepared around 10 years ago had access to all of the local resources. The 519 in Toronto has fantastic resources. There are LGBTQ-focused helplines that was circulated after the election results for trans youth in particular. But I think it's a challenge because the need is so great. And part of my frustration, I'll just be political for 1 second, is when people say, oh, they don't need this, they don't need that, they need counseling. But then they don't fund the counseling either. And I throw that number out so you see how significant it is. I'm a professional, my husband's a professional. We can pay and we can do because we do that for our kids, but normal people can't. It's insane.
I think we had another question.
Hi, I'm Josephine. I work for the Children's Aid Society, and the answer is not, can the society pay for this either? I don't think that's the answer, and I think that's what Tammy's also trying to say. I think society workers work in collaboration with families because I think the answer is it's a collaborative effect. I think the simple answer is, the simple answer for others is, can the society pay for that? And I think that's the misunderstanding. We don't have the ability to pay, and I think if you're not inside the agencies, you don't understand that that's not something we can do necessarily. We try to work with families because it's the agencies who have the funding, meaning counseling agencies.
Yeah.
So we work with families to try to help. And I think Tammy can elaborate on my answer.
Yeah, and it might also depend whether they're working voluntarily with the family or whether the child is in care, and then when the child is in care, there's benefits which could be used, but it's a real challenge, and thank you for clarifying that.
Hi, Laura Oliver, FOLA board. Mostly my experience has been in terms of the parents come in. And so are there parent organizations that we could refer clients to get peer support so that they can, work through, if they're supportive, great. If they're in the mushy area, can they transition? And if they're unsupportive, can they get some sort of counseling?
Yes. So the place I would start is EGAL, the organization I mentioned before, has a great affirming for adults guide. It's really relatable and understandable and where to start. The 519 has stuff. I would look at your local organizations. There for sure are. I can actually find, I have a kind of cheat sheet for these resources, including a lot of provincial ones. I'm happy to share it with you, Laura, and then have you circulate it. I prepared it for my OCL agent, so I may have to take some of the instructions off of it. But there certainly are organizations and groups, and if your kid was struggling with any other issue, what would you do? You'd get help to figure out how best you can support them. So yes.
Okay. My name's Sherry Hirschberg. I have one question and one comment. One of your slides earlier on had said about getting the OCL involved, and it had said through ADR. Tell me about that, because I don't know that we know that ADR provides a pathway into OCL appointment.
So, for child protection ADR, they can send us a notice, and then we can decide to get involved. We generally only do with kids that are slightly older, where we can establish their views and preferences. So I don't know the cutoff, it might be 7. So if it's a baby ADR, we wouldn't get involved because we're not going to be helpful. In parenting disputes, we have pilots. So the pilot started in the Central West region in Brampton, where if you do ADR through a court-connected service, they can seek our involvement. I think it might be Brampton and Guelph. I don't know if anyone is here from Guelph and can confirm, but that pilot has been operating for a couple of years. And well, funding is always an issue, but I think it's going well, and maybe there's a possibility of expansion.
So if that expanded, that would be wonderful, because the courts are pushing people towards the ADR, and the ADR that's court facilitated. And, you know, if that also gave a pathway, that would be wonderful. As far as you were commenting earlier on supports, community supports for mental health issues. Just as a comment, in the GTA, there's a navigation program run out of Sunnybrook, which is a
Family
great
Navigator,
yes, which is a great program for children with any mental health issues, to sort of work your way through the system and what's most appropriate.
Okay, I see one question, and then I've been told to wrap up.
Sorry,
Or no, that's the microphone?
Yes, I thought that was it.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you all very much.
On behalf of FOLA, I'd like to thank Tammy Moscow from the Office of the Children's Lawyer for coming here today and sharing such an important topic. It's a topic right now that's expressed in the media. It's a topic that's going to continue, and it's a topic that we need to embrace and not hide. We need to be educated, and we need to have compassion. And as lawyers, we're front line oftentimes, and we have that opportunity to make a real difference. So I just encourage everyone to take the knowledge that a lot of it is new and some of it's new to you. Some of it maybe you already knew, but take it away, embrace it, use it, and be kinder and more gentle in society. That's what we need. That's just my encouragement. And I thank you very much, especially given your flight today. And it appears you're a little under the weather, so I hope you're feeling better soon.